Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks ever so much for joining us here at Food Effective Life this afternoon. It's great to have so many of you attend, and I can see people already been busy in the chat box. My name's Roy Ballum, and I'm the Managing Director and Head of Education for the British Nutrition Foundation. And this afternoon, I'd like to introduce you to two other people. So I'm going to start with my work colleague, Frances, first of all. So Frances, do you want to say a quick hello and who you are?
Yes, hello everybody. So I'm Frances Meek, and I work with Roy and our colleague Claire at BNF, and also with AHDB as our partners in Food Effective Life.
Great, thank you, Frances. And you can see we've got somebody else that's pushed herself onto here today. No, not really, been warmly invited. And many of you will know Louise, who's the founder of the Food Teacher Centre. So to Louise, I wonder if you could just say a quick hello to yourself as well.
It's quite good. I can test the microphones working then as well, can't we? But get all the technology working. Hi, everyone. Really nice to be invited. Looking forward to this. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Louise. I've got a little bit of housekeeping, first of all. And what we're going to do, the three of us are going to give you kind of more of a conversational overview today around this whole issue to do with progression. So really looking at the learning, particularly focusing today on the practical food skills and recipes. And there's always a lot of chatter about this when you go to conferences, let alone on the Food Teacher Centre itself as well. I'm going to kickstart this afternoon, then I'm going to hand over to Louise, and Louise is going to give you her personal perspective around this. And then Frances is going to wrap up this afternoon looking at some of the resources and support that we've got on Food Effective Life, which we hope you might find helpful. So we're recording this webinar this afternoon, so we'll make this available afterwards. And equally, the presentation that we're showing will also be made available for you. So I believe Frances will probably nod or disagree with me, but I believe that we'll email you after this event with the links, so you'll get that. So that's really good. Any questions or observations, please pop them in the chat box. We'll do our best. Obviously, when we're presenting, we can't see the chat box, but we'll do our best to get back to you. That's not a problem. And at the end of the webinar, you should automatically be redirected to a very, very short survey. And it just really helps us understand what you think about the webinar, the sorts of things that we can do in the future. And it's really important to us. As you probably all know, British Nutrition Foundation is a charity. So when we're working on these sorts of things, it's really important for us to show funders and what we do and the impact that we have. If you're not then sort of linked off to your certificate and so forth, don't worry. Frances will email you, and again, we'll send you the links and everything. So, just you can chill this afternoon. Don't get anxious about that at all. Okay, well, I'm going to start. Louise and Frances, if you wish to turn your cameras off, by all means you can do. If you wish to show the gasps of amazement, then you can keep your camera as it is. But I'm going to kickstart with this. And we're really going to cover this afternoon areas of intent and progression, particularly, as I said, looking at the food skills going on. We then want to look at recipe complexity, which is, I think, is something that BNF has been looking at for quite a while here, and trying to look at the objective way of looking at a recipe in its progression rather than subjective and thinking, well, traditionally that's been called a high skill dish, for example. And there's a slight interpretation of high skill and what the dish actually is. We're going to show you how recipe complexity, you can add that to your planning. We're going to give you some learnings from Food Effective Life and show you some resources. So I hope that's all going to be very useful for you this afternoon. Okay, so let's first of all think about this learning intent and progression. So really, first of all, we need to think about what does the curriculum say and how does it itself represent progression. So if you're in England, if we think about Key Stage 3 cooking and nutrition, we've only got a few lines, even from Key Stage 1, 2 and 3, that represent that progression. We're going to look at that in a moment, but that's our starting place. And what we almost have to do is kind of fill in the blanks. We have to think about what the knowledge and the experiences and the practical skills that pupils need to demonstrate to fill in those gaps, to join those progression points as we go through, as I say, from Key Stage 1, 2 and 3. And the same would be true if you're from Scotland in Curriculum for Excellence. When you're looking at that, there are the kind of statements, the pupil voice statements, and it's about how we link those all together. It's also about how we interpret that curriculum, and people will come at this in very different ways. So there are other sort of pieces of documentation and scaffolding out there that can support you. So, for example, there's the core food competencies. There's lots of work on the Food Teacher Centre in the Resource Bank, on Food Effective Life website. We've got example of schemes of work, for example, as well as all of the work linked into age units with progression built in from the ground up. So it's worth having a look at that. We're also going to be thinking about what food skills, when and how. And a lot of that can be subjective, although there has been some research done into this, and we're going to share that with you after I've just finished this introduction. And then what is actually food skill progression? Because once you've learned how to spread something, isn't it just spreading? Or can you progress that skill even further? And that's just an interesting one. If you think about primary school children, maybe spreading like a fat spread on a piece of bread compared to spreading of a GCSE student, perhaps spreading the same type of thing, or perhaps icing or other things. So just thinking about it may be spreading, but what's actually happening there underneath that learning. And then we'd also just want to think about, thinking about different types of recipes. And we need to consider our modern world, which is full of diversity. And we need to think about health and as well as, being more sustainable. And we had a conference on Saturday that looked at this, and we can send you the links to all the recordings and presentations of that. This is just a few kind of watch outs. So let's have a little step back. And what we really need to think about is when we take the curriculum through to the classroom. So we've got the curriculum, we've got the key stage, we've got the year, we're developing those aims and learning outcomes for the scheme of work. We therefore want these lessons, which should be effective. They show progress and they're differentiated for our different learners. And then in the classroom, we're hoping to evaluate it ourselves as professionals, but also perhaps getting pupil voice. And that evaluation helps us make that circle, looking back at the scheme, back at the lesson. So that's just taking a step back. But this is what I mentioned earlier about how we can look at the top line progression. So if we're going from Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3, I've just highlighted in bold some of the key words. So basic principles of health to prepare dishes. It doesn't say what dishes, it doesn't say whether they're complicated or whether they're cooked dishes or cold dishes, but it just says some dishes. Then Key Stage 2 is introducing predominantly savoury. It's talking prepare and cook. So perhaps the word cook there is indicating heat. It could be, but cook is just one of those terms that could be, I could cook as in make a jelly, potentially. And then maybe it's cook a repertoire of savoury dishes to feed themselves and others, become competent in a range of cooking techniques. So we're given clues, but as professionals, we're asked to fill in the gaps as we go through. And as I say, we've been looking at this on Food Effective Life to give some suggestions and some input. And for me, it always comes back to what I was taught around sort of spiral curriculums. And it's about how you come back and repeat certain knowledge, let's say the Eat Well Guide, or certain skills on each year or over each key stage. So it's quite interesting for me that this might be for food, it might be healthy eating, cooking skills, where food comes from, food safety, consumer awareness, commodities, science, sensory work, and I'm sure many, many others as well. And I just think that's a very nice pictorial way of looking at that. But really, with food, it's really about, haven't we done this before? So again, it's thinking of that spiral curriculum. And even in Key Stage 3 here, how do you build those levels? Because that will give you that progression as we go through. So it's introducing, consolidating, and then potentially extending for those. And we might come in at different levels depending on the year group. So if we take healthy eating, that we're saying these are the key aspects, If we think about progression here, it's maybe food and drinks, it's 5 a day, it's eat well on top tips, it's knowing about nutrients and their function and their source. And then we get onto more complex things around ages and stages and special diets. So we can clearly see that being building up. So for cooking, though, what does that mean? So for us, that means maybe looking at a range of different types of food skills or different types of actions. And they're ones that we have the basic, that we extend, we practice, and we become more proficient in actually using those food skills. So I go back to my spreading example. If I'm 4 or 5 years old, I might be trying to spread a piece of bread and take most of the bread out of it with my knife because I've got holes in it. Whereas if I'm hopefully in secondary, I'm much more accurate and more precise with it because my motor skills are playing a greater role in this. And I understand the pressure that I'm applying, for example, or I know that the spread shouldn't be too cold on the bread because it will rip the bread because that's quite kind of delicate, for example. I might be thinking as well about the equipment that I might be using for this whole progression in food skills. So I might be thinking of everyday utensils. I might be thinking of extending those to a different range of different types of areas. So, for example, I might start with a knife going on to peelers. I might then even have egg slicers and all sorts of different things, different parts of a cooker, the hob, the grill, the oven, different electrical tools. And again, it's that practice and becoming more proficient. And all of this, I think, is wrapped up in this accuracy and precision, but also we need to think about always maintaining good safety and hygiene. And then things get more complex, and it's those combinations of skills that I believe makes a recipe or an activity more or less complex or high skilled. So if I've got some things with just 2 or 3 actions, 2 or 3 food skills, that is less complex to making something that's got lots of different food skills and stages. So like a lasagna has got lots of different things happening, whereas making beans on toast isn't. And even by looking at those recipe titles, you can tell that if you look behind the recipe, you can start to work out how complex something is. And the same with cooking. We also need to think about, yes, it's the practical skills, but equally we should be demonstrating the principles of good, healthy eating and nutrition as well. And of course, not forgetting things around creativity and people, diversity, and being inclusive too. And then all this recipe choice then supports those learning objectives. So it isn't just in year 7, we always make this, this, and this. It's in year 7, for example, we want kids to have these skills and these experiences, and then we pick the best recipes as a vehicle to demonstrate that. And it was quite interesting on Saturday. We had a couple of teachers showing 2 different ways of doing this. And we had some really interesting, quite new and very modern recipes that really showed food in a very different light. So when we're thinking about food skill progression, we've got the whole thing about acquiring the skills, developing them, and then securing them. And that also then links into the ingredients. So when you're using that ingredient, you will hopefully then with those skills, with that ingredient, learning to be doing it more with more precision and with more accuracy over time. And it's just where we plan our schemes of work, how we map this in to acquire, develop, secure with the precision and accuracy going forward. But what is the order of introducing these food skills? Well, there's no real established order, and it's very much dependent on you and your kids and your school. And sometimes it's really need to develop, need to consider about how children develop these at different times. And I mentioned motor skills, for example, being one of those factors that you might need to think about. At Food Factor Life, we've suggested different routes of progression, looking particularly at food skills, and you can look at those. And we've produced a practical skills chart as well. And in our secondary schemes of work, we also give some suggestions of the types of food skills and when they should be introduced, and looking at that whole area to go back to acquire, develop, and secure. So for us, it's about not basing it on the recipe name or type per se, but it's about the the skills and learning that recipe is going to give. But there has been quite a bit of research done around the fine and gross motor skills at different ages. And this is from a study, and it just shows you here the types of skills that are suggested to be introduced at different age ranges. So you can see here the first column where it says crude hand movements of ages of 2 to 3, washing fruit and vegetables, kneading and mixing with hands, tearing, which is quite interesting, isn't it, when you look at that? And you go through up the ages to the last column, for example, where you've just got additional skills, 9+, and you've got stirring and mixing, cutting, chopping, slicing, using scissors, using a peeler, skewering. And I think this is a really interesting way to use as a professional to start looking at our food skill progression and the order in which we could teach it. And this is based on some evidence research. Here's a traditional example. I've got my soda bread, which I would say maybe my first one. So I've got some mixing and weighing and, shaping and baking. And then I'm going to make some savoury swirls here. So I've got some bread, but I've kneaded it. And then I've got some knife skills. So I'm cutting up vegetables and I'm grating cheese. I'm rolling it up and, into Swiss roll type thing and baking it and decorating it and so forth. And then maybe I've done a finished fruit plat and it's similar to before, but I've enriched the dough and I've used a hob and I've added dried fruit and I'm mixing in spice and I'm platting and glazing. And over time, what you might see is that hopefully that accuracy and precision has also increased. And also the complexity of what I'm doing is increasing each time. And that's how I'm demonstrating progression as I go forward. And that's just my little arrow to show that going forward. So it's the type of skill, the number of skills, the number of related actions, the number of ingredients that I'm using. And I know you could say, well, does it really matter if using 26 different spices? But you get the idea of those sort of main big ingredients as I go through and that use of different types of equipment. And that's my complexity, not just the recipe name, because I could have just said bread. And that's the difference here. Here's just another example, a fruit crumble, weighing in, rubbing in, so forth, making to a scone-based pizza. So it's similar to before, but now I'm forming a dough, shaping, cutting and chopping. And I move forward, maybe into mini quiches. So I've got the same, but now I'm rolling out, cutting, lining, grating, mixing, baking, assembling, and so forth. And again, I've got the whole thing going up across the board. So for us, it's very much about the learning, not the recipe name. That's the key thing. We need to look at the recipes to ensure there's diversity and that offer our different cultures. Think about pupil voice. And one of the things that we had on Saturday was really about, does high skill always seem to equal high fat and sugar? And that sometimes we need to look at that and be mindful of this as well. We also need to think about that some traditional recipes are not inherently high skill at all. And they may just have lots of individual food skills and use more ingredients, so they might be more complex. So we need to be careful where we're using the term high skill, because what we really mean is the recipe is quite complex and it's got lots of different moving parts that pupils need to think about. And really, we need to make sure at the very beginning, we secure those food skills at the very bottom so that pupils can make those complex dishes with greater accuracy and precision as we go forward. So that's my kind of quick introduction to start with. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to hand over to Louise, who's going to give her perspective from the Food Teacher Centre. Thank you.
Hi there, everyone, and thanks, Roy. It's really interesting to have some time just to talk about progression in our subject. And it's really important because all subjects do this, and we need to be able to clearly map out what it means to move forward in the subject content and the subject skills. And I agree with everything that Roy has said. And Roy and Francis and I have had lots of discussions around this. And within the Facebook group itself, there's always a lot of discussion around skills, particularly when we get to the GCSE levels. And this is when our decisions around what makes something more skillful has an impact, very high stakes, because it's about what grade a student is going to get. And so I think we all feel really comfortable with the examples that Roy has given there, what the primary examples you're talking about as well, what the difference is about a student being able to handle a knife when buttering bread, what our progression route might be in sort of simple bread doughs, moving to more sophisticated things. And we can see how those skills build up. But I think we all get very nervous when we're then considering, as Roy says, what recipes might be considered high skill in that exam board and examination assessment sense. And I think I really appreciate this sense of this webinar in that as a community, I think we do have to have some common agreement and perhaps some more clearly laid out examples of what is considered a modern and forward-looking progression to higher skills that we could use in that assessment terms. I think, and obviously I was involved in the GCSE content writing and set out the skills that I felt should be taught at GCSE level. But I think we've got a little way to go with the exam board guidance, which is not always as clear as it might be in terms of that progression. And that's just a worry for all of us, because we don't feel that confident in knowing. And those questions come up all the time about what skill is lasagna? Is pizza a high skill? And it comes back to, as Roy quite rightly said, if we focus on what is a recipe rather than the skills that are involved, it starts to confuse us greatly. So I'm hoping out of this today, we can take some steps forward in supporting every teacher in understanding and having some clarity around the ranking of those skills. Some of the things that I advised Ofqual in terms of when I've looked at, some of the exam board specifications and some of the things that we took into account at that point was that, as Roy said, developing that competence over time and also independence in skills is certainly a key criteria of something that's higher skill. But for me, a few other things come into play. Something that requires regular practice over time, a skill that you have to hone and you perfect your technique and leads to a high quality result. So something that you wouldn't be able to do it right first time necessarily. So that's the difference between something like pastry, where you probably didn't make such a great attempt the first time you made it. But the more times you practice, the better you got. So things that require more practice are obviously, in my view, higher skill. And you might compare that perhaps to doing, mashed potato, where you can probably make quite a good attempt at doing mash the first time you do it. So things that require a bit of perseverance and building up children's resilience and not giving up over things, a bit of patience and a bit of repetition. And then they're able to get more consistent results. So then probably can't produce that consistent result the first time. So practice over time, perseverance, being able to produce a consistent result with that practice. The other thing that Roy mentioned about the research we have around sort of manual dexterity, and I think some of those what we consider higher level skills do require more mature, and that can come with age, but not always, more mature level of dexterity and sensitive handling. We've all seen students in our classes with something like an avocado, where it's a real compromise between holding it so you don't squash it, but being able to, cut it well, and even things like mango and other things like that. So having some sensitive handling, precision, particularly when you're talking about things like knife skills, and attention to detail. And the attention to detail might even be things around measuring, also come into play. So this is the use of the hands, very much in that as a manual dexterity and that level of control that a student might have, or the level of control that's required to be successful in that particular skill and particular recipe. So we've had practice over time, we've had this level of dexterity. I also think that something which makes it a higher level skill is that you have to know a bit about the working characteristics of the ingredients or the process to manipulate it, because it's not always the same. And we find that so much, don't we? The different absorbency that flour might have at different times, the different amount of flavouring you might have to add at different times in terms of even the strength of something like chili. How are you going to produce and achieve a uniform, consistent result each time? and being able to respond to that changing nature of the ingredients, being able to adjust from your experience to make sure you've got the right level of seasoning and flavouring, or the right amount of water, and how much moisture is going to be absorbed, how quickly you need to stir something, are all things that come with experience, aren't they? So just being able to react and adjust. The other thing that's, for me, makes this a higher level skill is that well-developed palate, and that being able to get a balance of taste, because out of all of this, we mustn't forget, this is all about making delicious food that people want to eat. So being able to produce those things and combinations, seasoning and tasting, are equally, in my mind, should be included as a higher level skill, or a skill we want children to progress over time. The creative side of it as well, the aesthetics of the dish, being able to display it as something appealing and appetizing, and perhaps originality, again, might be something where we want students to progress to. And finally, the final point I say is that something is more skillful when there's a much higher level of risk. There's a greater chance that the dish could go wrong. It's an unstable item to work with, and you need to control it carefully and have to work harder to get a high level quality end result. Are all things that I've sort of brought to the attention of thinking, what would we want to consider when we are talking about something as high level skill. But I'm really interested in this discussion, and I don't think any of us at this point have got all of the answers to this, and we're trying to work together to come up with a much more common understanding. And as Roy was saying, with the event we've most recently held, have something that helps us to outline this and pay attention to health, sustainability, and a modern look at diverse foods. So I think we've all been a little bit concerned that some of the examples that are given for example, GCSE, are more dated, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, and having examples that are relevant to right now. I think some of the GCSE, there was never an intention for the GCSE for the students to be producing restaurant quality food, or things that are almost Michelin star in their presentation. This was all about being able to be competent in the basics, us deciding what the basics are, and producing those competently and to a consistent high quality level, and being able to do that over time. So I'm sure we're going to move on now to what that sort of choice of skills and dishes, because I know that has been something that's bothered us all. So I'm going to pass back to you, Roy, so you can introduce that aspect of this discussion as well. Thank you for the opportunity to say my little bit.
That's great. Thank you, Louise. That's really helpful. And while you were speaking there, I was just texting Francis to say that I think we should probably write this up as a short article, and then get people to contribute. I think it would be really helpful to do that. And I think you've raised lots of very useful points this afternoon. So thanks ever so much for joining us. So you had your time on Saturday as well as today. So we've probably had enough of us this week, Louise, but thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. I'm going to hand over to Francis, who hopefully is still there. And what Francis is going to do is do more sort of an applied view at this, and just to see, so what support and suggestions and activities and ideas have we got on Food Effective Life at the moment? So Francis, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Roy. So hopefully in just a minute, excellent. You've given me control on the screen so I can move through. So thank you very much. So thank you both for going through that. Really interesting to hear your views, Louise. And as you said, that we've had lots of conversations over the years about this. And what I wanted to do was just go through some of the things that we've been doing on Food Effective Life, and particularly the complexity rating that Roy was talking about, and then also some of the resources that we've got available on the website that will be able to help you. So first of all, just thinking about the recipes we have. So hopefully you've been on the website, you've seen what recipes are available, and we've got over 300 recipes that are suitable for use in schools. And these can be searched through a number of filters. So the name, that's fairly obvious. the time, and we thought that was quite a useful thing because we know that a lot of teachers have got shorter lessons. So you may be wanting to find a recipe that you could particularly do within a certain period of time. So if you've got an hour-long lesson, you may actually want a recipe that could take a maximum of 45 minutes or 30 minutes. Or some of you may actually have longer lessons or the ability to leave something in the oven and take it out after the lesson. So we have got 90-minute plus recipes too. You can also filter by complexity, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute, age, cooking method, commodity, and also food skills as well. So here we are a little bit about our complexity rating. So Roy was talking about the fact that it is an objective rating rather than a subjective rating. And this is the thing I think that people do find so difficult. And as Louise says, lots of conversations on Facebook are around what level is this? How high skilled or low skilled or medium skilled is this dish? And often it is just an opinion, it's just subjective. So we just need to think about what makes a recipe more complex. Why is the complexity different or the same with similar dishes? Is more accuracy and precision required? Roy was talking about the very simple example of spreading butter or spread on a piece of bread. And that actually makes it really clear, I think, how that develops over time, the accuracy and the precision, but also the sort of chopping fruit and vegetables very roughly, perhaps at primary school, but then actually having to be very accurate when you're making something like a stir fry, perhaps later on, just so you get a quality dish at the end of it. Are the practical food skills different in the recipes? And are the number of ingredients the same? And I think what we do find is that a lot of the sort of the level that's given to recipes is actually given as sort of a bit historical, it's traditional. And I was a bit guilty of this myself, actually, when I was teaching, was that I had recipes that were particularly for years 7, 8, and 9. And therefore you think, well, obviously the recipe in year 9 is going to be more complex than the recipe in year 7. But actually sort of the food skills may be the same, but actually it's the recipe that's perhaps changed over time and additional aspects may have been added to it. And I'll show you some quite sort of interesting examples of that as we go along, how you can actually sort of change and develop recipes and to make them more complex. So a little bit more about our actual rating. So we've got some criteria and they are based on the number of ingredients and the number of actions, and we actually refer to that as sort of the verbs or the steps, the complexity of ingredient processing, and that includes the fact that a number of steps are required. So perhaps if you've made burgers and you've got a mixture of burgers, but you need to divide that mixture and make that into 4 or 6 evenly sized and shaped burgers. That's actually going to take more time and more accuracy and precision than another recipe that perhaps if you're just adding mince to a pan and making chili con carne. The same with deboning something or filleting it. And also we've included here high risk ingredients, because obviously the pupils have got to be a lot more careful with handling the ingredients at that point to make sure that they're being safe and not going to make anybody ill. Then we've also got the complexity of steps. So if they're going to be preparing some vegetables, whether they've got to finely cut them or whether they've actually been given a particular cut to use, so like a julienne. And then also the duration of the preparation. And we felt that the easiest thing for that would be to just make that the same as the number of steps. So on the screen, you can actually see an example of a recipe, and you can see that the way we go about this. So I get my highlighter pen and I literally highlight the number of ingredients, and I then again do the same with the number of actions, and then I work out the complexity of the steps and the complexity of the ingredient processing. And with this recipe here, cauliflower cheese, going through that process, we worked out that this was a low to medium complexity recipe. Now, here are some more examples. Now, obviously, this is a savoury filled choux bun, and I think we often find that people think that making choux buns is a high skilled recipe. But actually, in reality, when you make a choux mixture, you're mixing a few ingredients in the pan, and if you're doing it very simply, you're then just spooning it onto a baking tray and baking it in the oven. I know that's very basic, but if you're thinking in its simplest terms, choux bun spooned and filled with just cream cheese, we've worked out that that's actually quite sort of a low to medium recipe. But then actually you can make it more complex. You can take that basic recipe, you can pipe it, and then you can fill it with cream cheese and ham and tomato. And you then have to prepare your ham and tomato to go in the filling. And then you can make it even more complex, and you can pipe it and you can fill it with a homemade roux sauce and then the ham and the tomato. And you can see from the boxes underneath each of the recipes that it actually does become quite clearly more complex. So the number of ingredients increases. So from the basic one, you've got 9 up to 15. And then the actions or the steps, you can see that from the basic one, it's just 14 actions, but actually for the medium to high complexity recipe, it's 33 actions. So that is a very different recipe. So we've been doing this behind the scenes, and we've been doing it for a little while now, but we think it could be something that could be really useful for you to do in school yourself, but with your colleagues and also your pupils as well. We are fully aware that if you are teaching to an exam specification and there are dishes that you may be required to make, then you have to follow the requirements of the exam board. But we would like you to start sort of thinking about this, perhaps for sort of key stage 3, and also just getting, or sort of years 11 to 14, but just getting your pupils to think about it as well. So a practical activity you could do is working in pairs, so with your colleagues or with the pupils. You prepare 3 similar dishes, and examples we've got are scrambled eggs, omelette and frittata. And then as a teacher, you could work out and identify the learning intent for that particular recipe. As a teacher, we would always expect you to role model good practice. And then you could also think about how the recipes could be made in school, whether what age or phase, individually, pairs or in groups. And then if you're working with pupils, you would then identify the practical food skills used, and that would then be really useful for them to be thinking about the skills that they need for their exam specifications if you're at that point. And then you could then discuss the key nutrition messages and the functions of ingredients, all very, very important when we're thinking about the dishes that are made. And you could also think about further developments. So that could both be the teacher and the pupils. And then finally, you could suggest a recipe complexity. And we have got some recipes and an activity that can help you with this if you'd like to use it in class. But ultimately, it's important to remember it's not about the recipe title, but it's what that goes into the recipe, the ingredients, the skills, and the processes. So here are a couple of worksheets that you could use for this in the classroom if you wanted to do something like this. So there's one for the teacher and one for the pupil. So you could do this yourself or with colleagues when planning your schemes of work and your lessons. And you could either make the dishes if you wanted to, particularly if you're a new teacher. It's very, very good practice to make the dishes before you use them in class. Or you could just use the recipes in the way that we do it at BNF. And then with the pupils, you can actually do it with them to help them research, plan and trial in preparation for their practical examinations. It's really getting them thinking about why they're making the recipes they are, not just because they've been told to. And just a couple of things about the learnings that we've had. So we've won some training with teachers, and we did one particularly which is about practical food skills and recipe progression. And we did exactly what I just described. We asked the teachers to make 3 dishes and then identify the complexity of those dishes and then the other aspects that we talked about. And it was clear from the training that we did that the teachers found it a very useful process. And then we did something around learning intent as well. So we gave teachers the different recipes and we asked them to identify the learning intent that was behind them. And again, that was interesting because a lot of people, and again, something I was guilty of, was to say, right, the aim of this lesson is to make a quiche, and that would be your objective. But actually, it really is about the skills and the processes that go into making that quiche. And then the outcome is at the quiche at the end of it. So just very quickly, I just want to run through some resources that we've got to support the planning for your lessons. So we've got a practical food skills chart, and this was designed for our support for pupils and teachers with additional needs, or teachers of pupils with additional needs, excuse me. But we feel it's actually suitable for all settings. And so it gives the practical food skill with description, and then examples of how the practical food skill could be used and demonstrated in class. And then there is a pupil-friendly version as well. And then we've got a planning document that will help you for pupils 11 to 14 years. And this is based on our schemes of work for 11 to 14. And what we've done is we've identified the practical food skills that pupils should acquire, develop and secure. And then we've suggested a recipe, and we've given a web link for that, and the practical food skills that would be used for that recipe. We've provided some supporting notes, and then we've given some extensions to extend the complexity of the recipe. And then this is just the second page of it. We've just given a little bit of an explanation of our recipe complexity criteria, some notes to support, and then we've actually rated each of the recipes so you can see how it would fit in with progression. And then something similar, just a slightly different layout. And this is really for you to decide on the recipes that you want to use. So again, learning intent, the practical food skill, and then some examples of recipes that you could use. And these are links to the Food Effective Life recipes, and then space for you to put your suggestions, and then particularly to identify how they fit in with key nutrition messages. And then this one more is just sort of as an information sheet rather than a planning sheet. It's about applying nutrition knowledge. So we've given you the key knowledge that should be covered, the key learning points from that, and then also some recipe ideas as well. And then some support resources for GCSE. And although this is designed particularly for GCSE, it is editable and it can be changed for the other specifications around the UK. So again, we've given skill group techniques, recipe suggestions, and some notes from the GCSE content to see how it all fits together. And then we've got some other resources. We've got the lovely Food Passport. I really like this resource, which has recently been updated. And this is fantastic and can be used between transition between years 6 and 7, so from primary to secondary. And it's a really nice thing for the pupils to complete at primary school and then bring with them to secondary. We've also got an 11 to 14 food groups and practical food skills record sheet, so the pupils can keep their own record of the food groups that they've used and the food skills. And then there's a similar one for GCSE as well. As I said, all of these can be edited to suit your needs. And then these are some more of the resources that we've got to support complexity rating. So I was talking about the titles of recipes earlier on, and you can see from these 3 recipes on here, they are all titled apple and sultana crumble. But actually, if you were to look at them more closely, you can see that the first one actually used canned apples and canned custard. And the second one uses fresh apples and custard that's made with powder. And then the third one uses fresh apples and a fresh egg custard. So you can see same title, but actually a very different recipe. Right, so that was sort of my run through about the resources that we've got on the website that can support you and around complexity rating. I'm going to hand back to Roy in just a minute, but I'm just going to talk about some further training that we've got coming up before I do. So we've got some virtual practical workshops coming up. So in fact, we've got one this Saturday, and we have got some last minute spaces. So if you're interested, do go onto the website and have a look. They are designed, these practical workshops, for trainee, new and non-specialist teachers. So if you fall into one of those categories, do have a look and see if you'd like to come and join us. We've also got our 30th anniversary conference in November, and we're delighted that Henry Dimbleby is going to be our keynote speaker. And Louise is actually joining us on the day to be a speaker as well. We've got another webinar coming up at the end of December, practical food skills, cooking and food waste. And then we've got some more training coming in 2022. So more practical workshops, and particularly they're looking at food science and food skills. And then there's a presentation and styling webinar, and then careers during Careers Week with Tasty Careers. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for some training in the future.